Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 400. Welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to help support and inspire new trauma workers through this podcast and my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0. Thanks so much for joining me today, and here we go. All right, folks, reactivate the trauma-impacted brain with the help of these simple but effective trauma treatment worksheets by PESI. These take-home handouts by PESI give your clients structured tools that leverage the latest neuroscience insight to help clients think, express themselves, and finally experience lasting therapeutic improvement. PESI is allowing you to instantly access these today, absolutely free for Trauma Therapist Podcast listeners. Visit www.pesi.com/trauma worksheets. That's pesi.com/trauma worksheets to get your copy today. Trauma may be a fact of life, but it doesn't have to be a life sentence. Somatic experiencing is a psychobiological method of addressing clients' physical and emotional trauma conditions and helps to give voice to their experiences without a need for them to retell their story. SE is a complementary modality that focuses on regulation of the nervous system and offers the opportunity to engage, complete, and resolve the body's instinctual responses to traumatic experiences. For more information regarding somatic experiencing and the SE professional training program, please visit www.traumahealing.org. That's www.traumahealing.org. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Very excited to have back today Dr. Damon Wood. Damon, welcome.
Good morning. Good to be back.
All right. So Damon was my guest back on episode 370 of the Trauma Therapist Podcast, in which we talked about safety, creating safety within the context of working in a prison, so forth. Today, we're going to talk about, I'll let Damon describe more about what we talk about, but let me just give some context here. Damon has held an interest in trauma-focused therapy since his graduate education. He's completed trainings in sensory motor psychotherapy and internal family systems, as well as DBT. Since 2009, Dr. Wood has worked for the state of California in forensic institutions, including Napa State Hospital and 4 California state prisons, where he's provided treatment to the severely mentally ill, the severely behavioral challenged, and the severely traumatized. In 2015, Dr. Wood was promoted to the mental health leadership team at Salinas Valley State Prison, where he's led teams of clinicians to provide treatment in one of the state's most violent maximum security prisons. In this role and setting, Dr. Wood has championed trauma-informed organizational support for the clinical staff that work in such a stressful and difficult environment. All right, Damon, welcome back.
Good to be back.
So we had, last time we talked, it was clear that there was not enough time. There were so many avenues that we could have gone down and a lot that I think we wanted to. And we decided that we talk today about, kind of the elephant in the room is, what is it like to work in this type of setting? So let's kind of dive in here. Where would you like to start?
Yeah, I think this podcast episode specifically, we wanted to kind of look at working within the prison setting more broadly. Last time I was with you, I was kind of talking about working in that context as a supervisor and providing support to the line staff. But I think this episode might be interesting to really just kind of focus on what's it like working in a prison.
Right. Okay. So if we can start, let's kind of start with you. How the heck did you land there in the first place?
That's a great question. It was not my ambition to work in the prison setting. I ended up working in the prison system because after I graduated and got my PhD, I needed a postdoc and I needed to get paid. It was 2009, and so it was right during the throes of the Great Recession. I had bills to pay, I had student loan debt, and I had been working at a pre-doctoral internship that provided no stipend at all. And so I was looking around, and at that time, the prison setting was by far the best employer financially for a postdoctoral intern.
And is that still the case?
It's still pretty competitive. I haven't actually done any research on that, so I don't know.
Right.
Back then, the nearest I applied for a position, and it was up in San Francisco, which and they were offering less than half of what the prison setting was offering, with no benefits. So as a postdoctoral intern, it was a really great job, and I think it still is, because you get your hours, you get benefits, you get paid vacation, you get all of that. At that time, the salary for a postdoc intern was equivalent to the salary for a licensed psychologist at Kaiser. So that's since changed. I know Kaiser has dramatically increased their compensation for psychologists, but I believe it is still very competitive for postdocs.
Okay. Right. Okay. I remember that. All right.
Yeah. So it was just purely economics for me at that point.
Right.
But then once I got in there, I actually found it to be really quite fascinating. And 10 years later, here I am. So
Right. Well, just briefly, what about it was fascinating for you?
It's a completely different world. And you have access to a population of patients that you would never otherwise have access to. And so sometimes that can be really fascinating. It's also, one of the things that I think can be really rewarding working in the prison setting is it's kind of like, you're in the desert and you're bringing water to the desert almost, because there's so much need there. There's these people who really have never had much, if any, mental health treatment. And it's also a bit, I think it can be a little bit challenging just internally for a person, because you're working with people who have not only very often suffered from trauma, but have also been perpetrators of trauma. And so that's kind of, that can be challenging sometimes. But many times, it's kind of like there's the saying, like the catcher eventually becomes the pitcher. And basically, it's like some people who are victims of trauma go on to perpetrate trauma. And so it's kind of like that cycle of violence almost like intergenerational violence that you see.
So I would imagine that, having said that, there's a lot that goes on for a clinician. I'm helping, bringing water to the desert, but who am I bringing water to? This
Right.
person has done all this stuff. And so how do you negotiate and navigate those seemingly conflicting thoughts and feelings?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think it's important to kind of have a sense of really what type of crimes are really going to push your buttons. So, for example, clinicians who go in there and who are parents may find that when they're working with inmates who have been convicted of violence against children, that can be a real button. That can be really challenging, or whatever the case, your particular challenge might be. And so it's important to have an awareness so that you can do whatever self-care is necessary. It can, your countertransference can be a very legitimate issue, particularly in that setting. I struggle sometimes because there are times when I really wish that the resources that were being utilized for this population was available to the victims, right? And so that's a whole larger topic around social policy. And so, I would love to be able to provide these kind of services to the victims of the people I'm currently treating as well. And maybe someday that might be the case. But yeah, it's something to be mindful of just kind of internally, of how are you responding to someone. who has committed some pretty horrific crimes.
On this podcast, we talk a lot about goals and like what is the goal of the therapist. And granted, different therapists have different responses to that. But really, one of the themes that comes up is, a lot of seasoned therapists have talked about the goal is to be there, be present, be authentic, and allow the client's healing to unfold, and not to push, and not to be the person who's has all the answers and so forth. And I'm curious about what is the goal of the clinician in that setting? You said in a sense you're bringing water, but beyond that, what is the goal to provide? What kind of treatment? And granted, that probably differs, but
so it really depends on so I can speak specifically to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, right? CDCR. There are many other correctional systems, both at the county level, different states, and then of course there's the federal correctional systems. And so each system might have a kind of a different perspective on mental health care. CDCR specifically has been kind of forced to provide mental health care due to a lawsuit, what's referred to as Coleman. And the Coleman lawsuit has been around for over 20 years and has had a really profound influence on how mental health care is delivered and the type of mental health care that's delivered within the correctional system. So within CDCR, there are different levels of care for mental health. And so it kind of depends, your goal of treatment is really kind of dependent upon what level of care you're at. So for example, if you're at, say, the crisis bed, that the goal there is really short-term stabilization. So someone is psychiatrically really decompensated and you're trying to stabilize them, or they might be, imminently suicidal. And so you're trying to address that. And typically the turnaround time is within 10 days, right? So it's a really kind of short inpatient setting. But aside from that, if you're at, say, like an enhanced outpatient, or the lowest level of mental health care, what's called clinical correctional case management system, or correctional clinical case management, we just refer to as triple CMS. But anyways, that's kind of like an outpatient setting where you go and you see your clinician once every few weeks or every couple months or something like that. So the goals are going to be different depending on the acuity level, but broadly speaking, for me, in addition to like symptom management, the goal for me has always been to kind of help people get in touch with their own humanity. And that's kind of what informs my work in many respects. So I would say, to answer your question succinctly, symptom management, and then kind of this larger goal of finding your own helping someone find their humanity, and then survive prison, because prison is not a nurturing environment.
So that sounds, those latter two examples of finding your own humanity and surviving prison sound pretty involved, pretty intense. And do quote unquote sessions take place where? What does the actual setting look like for those?
Typically it's in your office.
Okay.
So we're limited many times by space. So, but typically, you might have an office on what's called a yard within, and your office will be set up so that it's as safe as it can be for the clinician, for you. So that means your seat sitting next to the door, so if you have to make a quick escape, you can. But yeah, typically it'll take place in an office. Now, if it's in the crisis bed, that's a different setup. Or if it's in an inpatient facility, like an inpatient hospital within the prison setting, that'll be a different setup. But for the outpatient setting, it's typically an office.
For me, full disclosure here, when I was actually considering doing prison work, but I was too scared to be locked up. Just the
Sure.
idea of going into a prison, and that just freaked me the heck out. It really did.
Yeah.
But beyond that, how do you personally, you're working with, like you said, severely mentally ill, behaviorally challenged. How does that affect you, impact you?
Well, it can be exhausting sometimes. And so I think it's really important to have some basic self-care strategies in place. And so that includes, just the basics that we talk about, I think, with clients, good nutrition, exercise, good sleep habits, a social life that are meaningful relationships. So you're getting fed by your life, and
Right.
so you have something to recharge your batteries. But after the end of the week, you're pretty drained. To be honest with you, it can be an intense setting, and it's not for everyone, right? Some people just find they don't like it. I think the setting needs to be kind of clarified as well to some degree, if we can, because it is very different than any other place you might consider working. It is its own world, and it has its own culture, and it even has, to some degree, its own language, because they use so many acronyms. It's kind of almost like the military in that regard. And it is actually kind of a paramilitary sort of a structure when you look at custody, and they have the different sergeant, lieutenants, captains, and that sort of thing. And so and they're operating kind of in a paramilitary fashion. So when you enter a prison system, just learning of the culture itself takes, I would, months. It really, I've been doing it now for 10 years, and I'm still learning things. But in order to really kind of get a sense of it, it takes a few months to really kind of start to get a feel for how things work. And the other thing that I think you need to be aware of is that because you're working within a forensic environment with basically convicted felons, right, that there's a whole nother element at play where there's the potential for gaming. And we're kind of getting off the topic of your question into another topic here, but and what I mean by gaming is that the inmates sometimes will try to entrap you into breaking a rule, so that they can then have leverage over you, so that they can get you to break an even more significant rule, specifically to bring in contraband.
Okay. So how might this play out?
Well, they can be really sophisticated. It depends. And so, the objective ultimately is one of basically two things. It's either contraband or sex. That's what they're looking for. And so they might try to get you to, it has to do with boundary violations is how it starts. And it starts with minor boundary violations. And so I think as clinicians, we've been trained in clinical boundaries. And if we can really be aware of that and maintain that, we've got a good start on how to protect ourselves from these types of games. But you just need to be aware of what the lines are that you can't cross. So for example, you would never mail an envelope for an inmate. If he were to give you a piece of mail to say, hey, could you mail this for me? You would never do that, right? Because you have no idea what's in the envelope. There could be, instructions for someone outside to assault or kill someone, right? And so then you mail it, you're involved in a crime. So it could start off really simply, like just a compliment, particularly for our female staff, a compliment about how she looks, right? And if it may seem somewhat innocuous in the beginning, but if it's not nipped in the bud, then it can escalate,
Mm-hmm.
right? And unfortunately, some people do get entrapped by these types of things. I've known clinicians and other staff who have gotten involved to the extent that they were bringing in drugs or cell phones, or or even engaging in some type of sexual activity with the inmates, all of which is illegal.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Damon, just
sure.
as you're talking, and this might sound crazy, but it almost seems to me like that setting could almost be more of an intimate setting than a setting on the outside. I mean, I could see where, an inmate who maybe doesn't have people visiting, or they think they've been wrongly convicted, and how they can, talk about that with their clinician and try to gain some kind of, emotional support from that. I mean, I can see how this could really play out.
Yeah, and so that kind of is one of the benefits of working there too, is that, like I said earlier, you're working with a population that has such a thirst for what you offer. And prison has a way of really stripping kind of the fluff from life. You're left with really a lot of the bare-boned essentials. And so a lot of times, people are really ripe for the treatment. Now it gets a little more complicated because, there may be a part of, I like to look at things from like an internal family systems perspective. So, one part of the client or the patient might be really engaged and really sincere in wanting to participate in the therapy, but another part of the patient may be have ulterior motives, right? And so maybe trying to get some need met by working with you that they're not disclosing and that that you're not aware of. And so, they oftentimes, one of the challenges is it's like, okay, so what is the mission, right? I mean, because when you think about it, part of the purpose of prison is retribution, right? I mean, prison serves several different functions, but retribution is one of them. If someone murders your family member, you want them to be punished, right? And so prison is not designed to be comfortable. It's to some extent designed to punish the people for really bad behavior. Now, there's also the purpose of rehabilitation as well. And so, I think sometimes clinicians struggle with, what am I doing here? Like, what's the goal? Getting back to that earlier question, right? I mean, so helping individuals, guys, kind of, treating their mental illness, treating their symptoms, helping them develop better coping skills, all of that is certainly part of what we do. But at the same time, they're suffering. And we can't alleviate all of that suffering because of the environment they work at. And we probably shouldn't try to, right? And so sometimes I have to, as a supervisor, sometimes I remind staff, like, look, this is a prison. We can't fix everything for them. Right. They're going to come to you, kind of complaining or upset about something, how it's not working in their life. And that's just prison, right? That's a little bit outside of our scope. So let me give you a concrete example. In most, like at the higher security levels, inmates are put in cells with two people, right? Two men to a cell. And, a number of guys would like to be in a cell by themselves, right? And to get what's called a single cell status. And so they ask their clinicians, hey, they may say, hey, I'm really suffering with these PTSD symptoms. I really need a single cell. And so they're trying to convince their clinician to do the paperwork necessary to recommend single cell status for them, right? And, as a supervisor, I have to remind clinicians, like, that's really not our job. I mean, there has to be some really overwhelming evidence that someone is so impaired that they can't cell up with another inmate. And if they're that impaired, they probably need to be in a hospital, right?
Okay.
So, but the population, certain members of the population that you're treating will try to kind of play on your innate compassion to try to get something, whether that's something concrete like a single cell or just something more, in the form of greater pity or compassion or empathy, right?
I could see how that could be really challenging because the stakes can be potentially pretty high. So here you are, as a therapist going in there, wanting to introduce someone, help them rediscover their own humanity, and yet these boundaries have to be, I don't know, it just feels like you have to have your guard up almost all the time. Obviously that's...
Yeah, I mean, you have to, you develop what's called correctional awareness, right? And that takes some time. And you just kind of, you learn to kind of call a spade a spade. You call it as you see it. And if you get the impression that someone's bullshitting you, excuse my French, but then, in my opinion, you just call it. And then that can potentially become sort of the grist of the therapy, right? But if you don't call it out, then it's in the room. It's sort of the elephant in the room, but no one's talking about it.
Right. So in a way, it almost seems like the setting demands a certain authenticity. That's got to be right there, a directness and immediacy, right?
I think so. I mean, I guess that depends also on kind of your perspective, and but I really believe so. And I find that the population, the guys seem to respect me more when I speak their language. And so when I'm sitting with them, I may swear in session. I'm not swearing at them, right? But I may just swear because, and then suddenly I'm more relatable to them, right? I'm not some, doctor that, so I'm leveling kind of that field with regards to the power balance.
Yeah.
But I think if you're authentic, and they are experts at sniffing out inauthenticity, right? If they get a sense that you're bullshitting them, they'll pick it up really quick, and that'll have profound implications for the treatment because they'll shut down.
You talked a little bit before about who this setting might be, quote unquote, for and not for. Who do you think? We have a lot of people who are listening out there who are therapists of varying types and so forth and levels of experience. But if you could say, who do you think would the setting would be good for?
It's a great question. And, we have people who are just starting after graduate school, and we have people who, after 30 years of working in private practice or in other settings, are now here. So, for example, I have a guy that works in one of my programs, and he's retired. He's 70 years old. He's spent 40 years working as a psychologist, both as providing direct patient care and also as an administrator. And he's working in the prison system to kind of, because he originally to give himself something to do in his retirement, but now he's really enjoying it, right?
Wow.
So to be successful in the prison setting, you have to be able to work within the system. And the system sometimes can be just as challenging, if not more so, than the population. right? And so that's something to just be aware of from the outset. In fact, my very first clinical supervision session as a postdoc, like week one, almost 10 years ago, one of the first things my supervisor said to me was, it's not the inmates you have to worry about. And that has been so true, because inmates, they're inmates. And, once you kind of get a feel for how to work with the inmates, like they're going to do what they're going to do. And you learn how to deal with that. But the system, that the whole prison system itself, because there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of court cases, there's some pretty in mental health, the documentation requirements are pretty hellacious, and so you have to be able to work within a system that is at times somewhat inflexible. So you have to be flexible, right? You just have to kind of take things in stride and not take things personally, and flow. Because if you want to be the reed, not the oak, right? Because when the storm hits, the reed will bend and the oak will break. And so as long as you can be flexible, then I think you'll do okay.
Awesome. Two things before we sign off here. Before we started recording, you mentioned a book.
Yes.
Let's talk about that a little bit.
The book is called Games Criminals Play, and it's by Bud Allen and Deanna Bosta. I don't know if it's in print still. It may be. Within it, there's an article that's from one of the chapters. There's an article called Anatomy of a Setup. And some institutions, some prisons actually hand this out to their new staff during the new employee orientation. But it's a really good primer on being aware of kind of the manipulations that can take place in the prison setting. And then how to kind of, awareness is the biggest protective factor at all, but then how to protect yourself, how to deal with it when you start getting a sense that, someone's trying to set you up.
Okay. I did just find it on Amazon, actually.
Okay, great.
I'll have that linked up at the show notes page. So, and then secondly, and finally, we were talking about safety, and in the prison system, and I love that word, that phrase that you mentioned was a correctional awareness. It just reminded me of self-awareness and so forth. How do you, as a supervisor, manage that type of safety for the individual clinicians and your team as a whole?
So as a supervisor, I just try to provide some pretty consistent messaging about some basic safety principles. So for example, I'm kind of always looking around. Do you have your whistle, right? Do you have your alarm? Is it on your person? Don't leave it in your desk, right? Because when something kicks off, it can happen really fast. And so, so some of it is, as a supervisor, is just making that messaging consistent. Because you want to, for example, I'm a believer that you want to have your whistle and your alarm in the same place at all times. So you don't have to think, where is it, right? It's just a automatic muscle memory response, right? And then just, you getting to know officers, they'll help, give you some good advice and some good tips. Always know where your exits are, kind of, knowing, just being aware of what's happening around you is really a big part of it. But the safety is actually pretty safe compared to, say, for example, the state hospital system. Mm-hmm. When it comes to personal safety, I'd much rather work in a prison because you have correctional staff all around. And as soon as something happens, they're running towards the incident, wherever it is. And so, whereas in a hospital, like Napa State Hospital, for example, staff are the ones that have to be the first responders, and there's far more injuries on staff in the hospital setting.
As you know, as we were preparing for this, and I was sending you some questions, and I realized that I was really focusing on like a question like that. What do they have to be? You have to be concerned about, or safety. And you said, well, there are some benefits too to this. There's some upside. So let's talk a little bit about that before we go, because I want people to hear that too.
Yeah, I mean, kind of what I went back to before is, you're going to find some people who are really, really ripe for what, and really wanting what you have to offer in a very sincere way. And they may never have had anything like this in the past. And suddenly you come along and, they're just so ready, and at a very existential level. I mean, because you're dealing many times with issues that, they're like, what the hell happened to me that I ended up here? Mm-hmm. Right. And so for many of these guys, when they're really ready, they're ready to kind of buckle down and go to work, and they're dealing with some very profound issues that you probably aren't going to see in the outside, in the civilian setting.
Mm-hmm. When you say, they're probably very ready and ripe for what you have to offer, meaning what? Relationship, rapport, listening,
doing some self-reflection, some really kind of, I mean, the system is, if you think of the prison system almost as a mirror, they've clearly done something that merited them being in a pretty horrific environment. Mm-hmm. And so when they're really ready to kind of look at themselves, to ask those questions of, what happened that led to, what was the pathway that I was on that led me here? Why am I here? What could I have done differently? Why did I do what I did to get here? Then there's a real opportunity to do some really deep work. Not everyone is going to go there, obviously. Not everyone is capable of that. But, I know of one guy, for example, who was in my program that someone was treating. And, he was basically a serial killer. And he was really a monster for a long time. And now he's kind of an old man, and he's really kind of excavating his life to figure out, what the hell led me down that path.
Right. Wow.
So that can be pretty fascinating.
Right. Damon, I want to thank you so much for coming back here. This whole topic is fascinating and just continues to be I think a great asset for this podcast. So tell our listeners before we go how they can reach you.
Yeah, my email address is damonwoodphd@gmail.com.
Okay, I'll have that linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. All right, sir. Thanks so much for spending this time with us. We'll talk again.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
The Foundation for Human Enrichment, DBA Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute, is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to resolving trauma worldwide by providing professional training and education in somatic experiencing. It was founded by Dr. Peter Levine, author of Waking the Tiger, who developed somatic experiencing based on explorations of how animals deal with threat and traumatic experiences on a daily basis. Learn more about somatic experiencing and the SE professional training at www.traumahealing.org. That's www.traumahealing.org. All right, I want to thank our friends at PESI for providing the cutting-edge and innovative treatment strategies and techniques that are needed to meet the changing demands of your clinical work. PESI connects you with today's leading experts through their state-of-the-art continuing education. PESI invites you to become a leading expert in the field of trauma treatment and neurobiology-informed treatments. Heal trauma, save marriages and families, and help clients take back their lives when you sign up for Janina Fisher's Complex Trauma Certification Training. PESI is giving Trauma Therapist podcast listeners the chance to save $500 today on level 1 and level 2 training at PESI.com/trauma treatment. That's PESI.com/trauma treatment. This education meets the requirements to become a certified clinical trauma professional. Learn with PESI today.